Hello everyone, today we read and comment the fourth chapter of the fourth book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege, the title being The Combat in General Continuation. The text follows. In the last chapter we showed the destruction of the enemy as the true object of the combat, and we have sought to prove by a special consideration of the point that this is true in the majority of cases and in respect to the most important battles, because the destruction of the enemy's army is always the preponderating object in war. The other objects which may be mixed up with this destruction of the enemy's force and may have more or less influence we shall describe generally in the next chapter and become better acquainted with by degrees afterwards. Here we divest the combat of them entirely and look upon the destruction of the enemy as the complete and sufficient object of any combat. What are we now to understand by destruction of the enemy's army? A diminution of it in relatively greater than that on our own side. If we have a great superiority in numbers over the enemy, then naturally the same absolute amount of loss on both sides is for us a smaller one than for him, and consequently may be regarded in itself as an advantage. As we are here considering the combat as divested of all other objects, we must also exclude from our consideration the case in which the combat is used only indirectly for a greater destruction of the enemy's force. Consequently also only that direct gain which has been made in the mutual process of destruction is to be regarded as the object, for this is an absolute gain which runs through the whole campaign and at the end of it will always appear as pure profit. But every other kind of victory over our opponent will either have its motive in other objects, which we have completely excluded here, or it will only yield a temporary relative advantage. An example will make this plain. If by a skillful disposition we have reduced our opponent to such a dilemma that he cannot continue the combat without danger, and after some resistance he retires, then we may say that we have conquered him at a point. But if in this victory we have expended just as many forces as the enemy, then in closing the account of the campaign there is no gain remaining from this victory, if such a result can be called victory. Therefore the overcoming of the enemy, that is, placing him in such a position that he must give up the fight, counts for nothing in itself, and for that reason cannot come under the definition of object. There remains, therefore, as we have said, nothing over except the direct gain which we have made in the process of destruction. But to this belong not only the losses which have taken place in the course of the combat, but also those which, after the withdrawal of the conquered part, take place as direct consequences of the same. Now it is known by experience that the losses in physical forces in the course of a battle seldom present a great difference between victor and vanquished respectively, often none at all, sometimes even one bearing an inverse relation to the result, and that the most decisive losses on the side of the vanquished only commence with the retreat, that is, those which the conqueror does not share with him. The weak remains of battalions already in disorder are cut down by cavalry, exhausted men strew the ground, disabled guns and broken caissons are abandoned, others in the bad state of the roads cannot be removed quickly enough and are captured by the enemy's troops. During the night numbers lose their way and fall defenseless into the enemy's hands, and thus the victory mostly gains bodily substance after it is already decided. Here would be a paradox if it did not solve itself in the following manner. The loss in physical force is not the only one which the two sides suffer in the course of the combat. The moral forces are also shaken, broken, and going to ruin. It is not only the loss in men, horses, and guns, but in order, courage, confidence, cohesion, and plan, which come into consideration when it is a question whether the fight can be still continued or not. It is principally by the moral forces which decide here, and in all cases in which the conqueror has lost as heavily as the conquered, it is these alone. The comparative relation of the physical losses is difficult to estimate in a battle, but not so the retaliation of the moral ones. two things principally make it known. The one is the loss of the ground on which the fight has taken place, the other the superiority of the enemies. The more our reserves have diminished as compared with those of the enemy, the more force we have used to maintain the equilibrium. In this at once an evident proof of the moral superiority of the enemy is given, which seldom fails to stir up in the soul of the commander a certain bitterness of feeling and a sort of contempt for his own troops. But the principal thing is that the men who have been engaged for a long continuance of time are more or less like burnt out cinders. Their amount is consumed, we have melted away to a certain extent. Physical and moral energies are exhausted, perhaps their courage is broken as well. Such a force, irrespective of a diminution in its number, if viewed as an organic whole, is very different from what it was before the combat, and thus it is that the loss of moral force may be measured by the reserves that have been used as if it were on a foot rule. Lost ground and want of refreshed reserves have therefore usually the principal causes which determine a retreat, but at the same time we by no means exclude or desire to throw in the shade other reasons, which may lie in the interdependence of parts of the army, in the general plan, etc. Every combat is therefore the bloody and destructive measuring of the strength of forces, physical and moral. Whoever at the close has the greatest amount of both left is the conqueror. So this is only the first part of the chapter. It will follow at least another one or two, maybe, because it's fairly long. And in here, Von Clausewitz fundamentally highlights which are the most important factors that the destruction of the enemy forces brings on the field, right? How this happens and how it can be measured fundamentally in outline, right? Not considering every combat as equal in the degree of destructiveness. We have seen in the previous chapter, and Von Clausewitz raised in here that, of course, the greater the engagement is, the more that object is aimed at. But and naturally, every combat has its own strategical logic, its own weight in the campaign, and that's exactly the reason why there is the aforementioned distinction. And so simply, the combat in general, continuation. In the last chapter from Clausewitz writes, we showed the destruction of the enemy as the true object of the combat, and we have sought to prove by a special consideration of the point that this is true in the majority of cases, and in respect to the most important battles, because the destruction of the enemy's army is always the preponderating object in war. Right, so way or another, there is a sort of essential constitutive logic in combat, which is the one of destroying the enemy. Right, there's never like a combat, doesn't matter how marginal, secondary, or part of a much more complex strategical action is fundamentally devoid of the objective of causing or inflicting destruction, bringing destruction upon the enemy forces. If anything, even if it just was in potential, right, that we could move simply detachment behind the enemy lines just to create disarray while we attack it on the main front, and in that case, for example, there is both the possibility of an active employment of that unit during combat, but simply its presence in there is enough to make the enemy consider, if he's aware of that could bring even more destruction against the enemy encircling it, cutting its retreat, and so on. So in any case, the destruction of the enemy's army is always the preponderating object in war, and this is proportionally the greater in the most important battles. Like, clearly so, for many reasons that we have analyzed, but principally the object in war is what makes it lead there. So combat battles are fought for that specific reason, and the greater the forces involved are, the less you can sophisticate their employment in many ways, and the more there is therefore this direct fight that entails the most devastating destruction that occurs from these clashes of forces. Then von Clausewitz writes, the other objects which may be mixed up with this destruction of the enemy's force and may have more or less influence, we shall describe generally in the next chapter and become better acquainted with by degrees afterwards. Here we divest the combat of them entirely and look upon the destruction of the enemy as the complete and sufficient object of any combat. Right? So, as we are exemplifying now, there may be different. Every combat is different, right? Historically speaking, there's not a single combat that has ever been equal to another. That will never be in the future by any stretch of the imagination, and naturally this modifies the way that the armed forces are employed in this specific combat. But at the same time, there is always an essence that here is what Clausewitz is focusing on, that is, as we have just pointed out, recalled, is the destruction of the enemy. Right. So it's that simple, and we will get acquainted, as Von Clausewitz says, with the rest in other, the more we go through the Vom Kriege. Then Von Clausewitz writes, what are we now to understand by destruction of the enemy's army? Right? So a diminution of it relatively greater than that on our own side. Right? This is a axiomatic, properly quantitative, tell you about forces not just as numbers, but properly as the forces, moral and physical alike. So to make it simple, when you fight against an enemy, you have to ensure, given these, let's say, divestment, as von Clausewitz puts it, of other, let's say, strategical reasons for whichever that combat happens, it was just to knock each other's out. The destruction of the enemy's army is gained by increasing the proportion of destruction in the enemy forces, right, compared to your own, right? That's the axiomatic, asymptotic, the direction that you have to reach, which means that not only you have to destroy the enemy forces, but you have to do it in a way that allows you to properly continue fighting over someone that at some point has to give up, right? So that's why suicidal warfare, we can call it like this, I don't know, kamikaze tactics or just suicide bombing and all this stuff, is actually a desperate maneuver for reasons that at that point elude much of the military reality, that if you have to recur to such means, it's definitely pretty grim from your side. It has mostly a political color by that point. That is not to say that suicide attacks are always devoid of a military logic. Of course there are, and actually there are enormous examples from, think about the French Foreign Legion in Mexico, at Cameroon, etc. But once again, that's what von Clausewitz has divested the combat from. That is, this broader strategical dimension at that point was more important than the combat between the units who were engaged specifically. So that's why von Clausewitz points out that those are equally important, can be, as those that specific example, for instance, shows, but that do not have to distract us from the essential here, and then we will descend into anyway. Then von Clausewitz writes, if we have a great superiority in numbers over the enemy, then naturally the same absolute amount of loss on both sides is for us a smaller one than for him, and consequently may be regarded in itself as an advantage. So if you have a superior force to the one of the enemy, and in the combat that follows, even if you win, even if the enemy abandons the combat, it's even annihilated, but has inflicted to you the same amount of losses you did on him, he has technically gained the upper hand in the combat after all, right? So you have suffered more losses than him, and you can't perhaps claim to have technically, accomplished something positive out of it. Von Clausewitz says then, as we are here considering the combat as divested of all of other objects, we must also exclude from our consideration the case in which the combat is used only indirectly for a greater destruction of the enemy's force, which is the example we made at the beginning. Consequently, also only that direct gain which has been made in the mutual process of destruction is to be regarded as the object, for this is an absolute gain, This is very important. Like, the forces you deployed cannot be put in relative terms from the perspective of combat, right? You can't fake the fact that you have lost them, because that's an absolute loss, right? It can't be relative to the campaign. You can maybe lose all the forces you want up to the point the enemy is destroyed. In some ways, it's kind of a imaginific situation after all, because even those situations that kind of were closer to that in reality never were like, okay, I can spare all the troops I want for real, right? It has always a cost, political, military terms, if anything, and naturally also from a strategical point of view. And for Clausewitz writes, which, with an absolute gain, which runs through the whole campaign, and at the end of it will always appear as pure profit, right? So even here, always remember that, of course, as we're pointing out now, war isn't just continuation of politics by other means. So if you have maybe won the war, so it was worth it after all, but you have to still to take into account that you have lost that amount, and that is it's not gonna be forgotten. It's not going to be go away magically over. You have lost that, and you can't have it anymore, right? And von Clausewitz then writes, but every other kind of victory over our opponent will either have its motive in other objects, which we have completely excluded here, or it will only yield a temporary relative advantage. An example will make this plain, right? And von Clausewitz writes, if by a skillful disposition we have reduced our opponent to such a dilemma that he cannot continue the combat without danger, and after some resistance he retires, then we may say that we have conquered him at that point. But if in this victory we have expended just as many forces as the enemy, then in closing the account of the campaign there is no gain remaining from this victory, if such a result can be called a victory. Right, so that's the same example before, so that you have actually accomplished an enemy retreating from a position, but if by terms of these outcome, you have lost basically the same amount of forces as the enemy, that is going to wait in the campaign, right? That is going to remain. It's not something that is going to be forgotten. As a consequence, von Clausewitz writes, the overcoming the enemy, that is placing him in such a position that he must give up the fight, counts for nothing itself, and for that reason cannot come under the definition of object. Right. The point is that here it's subtle to picture this, given that von Clausewitz divested once again this essence from whichever secondary reason we may have here, except the destruction of the enemy. You can have obliged the enemy to move, but you haven't obtained anything in terms of its destruction. That you basically have failed, right? And so once again, it's different even from cornering the enemy, because the enemy here is simply going to move away with forces that you're supposed to have destroyed, instead you didn't. Right? So this thing is not being properly productive. You shouldn't focus on actions that are aimed at bullying the enemy fundamentally, but do not bring with other reasons to knock him out properly by distracting him. So this is a very interesting point, because it combines another element, a counter element, to the one of the secondary reasons for which you may have carried out that action. Right? It's not that as long as they exist, this thing disappears. That remains, because that's actually the absolute element, the absolute object of combat. That is what war is all about, after all. And von Clausewitz says, but to this belong not to the process of destruction not only the losses which have taken place in the course of the combat, but also those which, after the withdrawal and conquered part, take place as direct consequences of the same. Right, so this can be also another aspect. You may oblige the enemy to leave to abandon the field in a hurry, and this could be naturally profitable. You can pursue the enemy, you can take him out. So putting him in a condition that is even in which it's even more favorable to flee in disorder than actually stand up and fight, which has an importance as long as you destroy the enemy forces at that point. Not simply if they run away, right? That's actually the moment in which you should be looking for to inflict the heaviest blows. For Clausewitz writes, now it is known by experience that the losses in physical forces in the course of a battle seldom present a great difference between victor and vanquished respectively, often none at all, sometimes even one bearing an inverse relation to the result, right? And that the most decisive losses on the side of the vanquished only commence with the retreat, that is, those which the conqueror does not share with him. This is important, and it's actually, it sounds banal for anybody who has studied, battles, military history, but that objectively is not often pointed out, not even by the same sources, mostly because what happens during combat is actually very difficult to determine. As von Clausewitz, it's one of the most important aspects of the historical theory of the Vom Kriege, because he says, we have doubts even about the causes of the outcome, are what the outcome has actually been. And can you imagine in the massive combat, can even determine how many died in a way or another? So that's important. That's something you can, for example, calculate from the side of the winner, right? And even in there, it's not so easy as it seems, but you may never know there unless you actually try to make a scientific count of the bodies on the area of the battlefield to when and how the thing properly happened, or where is that the enemy basically felt broken, because that's about maybe the physical destruction that, as we've seen, is always connected with the moral one, but they're not always the same thing. They do not even say properly, in fact, to which decision that person died for. That's quite important actually to point out. And it may as well happen. This actually happens pretty often, that the winner in combat can suffer more casualties than the defeated, right? Then eventually will suffer many more in absolute terms during the pursuit, but that at the moment of combat may be inflicted more. And von Clausewitz writes, the weak remains of battalions already in disorder are cut down by cavalry. Exhausted men strew the ground, disabled guns and broken caissons are abandoned. Others in the bad state of the roads cannot be removed quickly enough and are captured by the enemy's troops. During the night, numbers lose their way and fall defenseless into the enemy's hands, and thus the victory mostly gains bodily substance after it is already decided. Here would be a paradox if it did not solve itself in the following manner. Right. So here von Clausewitz points out what happens during a phase of pursuit while the physical forces are properly destroyed, right? And this highlights actually the importance of the moral forces we'll see in a while, that are the ones that explain how, in fact, the mere destruction of combat happens mostly after the engagement, right? Happens, it's as a part of combat proper, but after the combat, as von Clausewitz points here, has already been decided in favor of one or another side. It's very important to stress. It's one of the first things you learn when you get acquainted with warfare in general, and it's quite easy to explain, but it's often not conceived in fact the moral decision of the engagement as such that eventually brings to the physical destruction. Because von Clausewitz writes, the loss in physical, he even says, it's a paradox apparently, right, that it's not the combat in itself that actually destroys the most. It's actually what happens once it's decided, once most of the contrast of one side is over fundamentally. This is very important. And von Clausewitz, in fact, says the loss in physical force is not the only one which the two sides suffer in the course of the combat. the moral forces are also shaken, broken, and go to ruin. It is not only the loss in men, horses, and guns, but in order, courage, confidence, cohesion, and plan, which come into consideration when it is a question whether the fight can be still continued or not. It is principally the moral forces which decide here, and in all cases in which the conqueror has lost as heavily as the conquered in these alone. Right? And very important, especially the last phrase, because it says, that properly the route or the disengagement in general with something that happens, and you say why? I mean, who decides that? Well, most of the times it's not properly a decision. There is not someone who calls the retreat and when it's disengaged. This can be valid for, as you see in movies, like the general observes the battlefields, things are turning bad, say, okay, well, let's go out of here before it's too late. But what was actually happening is that the army there is giving way by itself, right? Because morally speaking, these people cannot fight anymore. It's not even that they lack the means. Technically, they could go on sometimes. There are certain battles that show such a determination for which soldiers literally fight till the very end. There is always, for example, during a retreat, there is always someone that keeps on fighting so that others can flee, right? If you look at basically every battle, this happens here, where and another. It doesn't matter whether it's, you actually find it in sources or not, may not say that, but that always happens in a way. But the majority of the army starts giving way on its own, right? It's something that takes place because the enemy is putting you under such a pressure that simply you give way instinctively, right? It's not like properly a rational decision, because there is that too, but a discipline and the same, all the reasons that can bring you to fight on the field are powerful enough if you're already there in the first place to have brought you there. So it's not you go there to say, okay, I will flee as soon as the battle begins. Also because you're within a group that tendentially discourages you to do that in the same way. So that's also very important. As we've seen, there is a military virtue in an army and all that. There are certain points you simply can't take it anymore, and you break, right? The other aspect is in here that this break happens when also the enemy forces, the forces of the winner side, have reached the peak properly, right? And they are pushing forward also and still suffering in a way, because there's also to consider in all of this that while the enemy army is breaking, you should press on to defeat this and it's hard to make it break fully, and it's actually hard, right? There is always someone who's going to resist, as we've seen. So there is going to be other bloodshed, and most of the times, given the general disorder, the general sufferings and traumas that have been received during battle itself, these actions happen in a much more bloody way. At least there is much less care, right, than at the beginning of the battle in which they are carried out. Therefore, there are more losses proportionally in these situations. But that tells you how, the element of instinct, if you want, has risen over the cold, rational conduct of war in that sense. And this is so also very important because the enemy, the winner side, has taken those losses and is probably, very spirited by the fact that you're breaking, and he really wants to make you pay for all the losses that you inflicted him at that point. So it's really a dreadful situation that, by no surprise, actually brings to the slaughter afterwards. All right, and always picture this even in a duel, right? The ultimate thing of a duel, if there are two guys beating each other, at the end there is someone standing on the ground. Rarely you will find someone who stops to fight, even when you have knocked the enemy out of combat. You're going to want to actually give a lesson and to do things that are objectively in fact sanctioned by law, that are not fair. But this happens, and it happens on a larger scale in war as well, right? For the simple reason, differently from two guys beating each other that are going under someone's, they're going under justice. A world of powers that do not really have much of another authority over them but themselves, right? So wars in this sense can be something devastating, even just in the outcome of the battle. This is not just about combat forward, this is also about the consequences of a war that are often forgotten. War is not much just what happens during the time it's fought. It's also what it entails afterwards, that, as crude as it sounds, it's sometimes even worse than death, right? And it can definitely bring to much utter death in the process anyway. So these are terrible aspects. And von Clausewitz rightly points out how, in fact, it's probably the moral forces in this, cracking moment that give up, right? It's not about the mere material elements of the story, because you have come there to fight, and that's something terrible. I mean, it's counter instinctual. Like, people will think that war is instinctual, that humans fight it because they're just like animals, but they're completely far from reality. War is by definition something artificial, reasoned, right? It goes against instinct of survival. It's not stupid at all, right? And the reason why it's fought, there are reasons for which it's worth to die for. And history shows this in such an uncontrovertible way that it's even embarrassing that such a huge chunk of people in our culture can even imagine to think something like that. But that's probably the point in which you break. You're not just exhausted, you simply say, I give up, right? Even if that means you be killed, as it happens, unfortunately. But even if that meant, my country at home is going to be ravaged, my family is going to be slaughtered, you give up, right? It's relevant. It's a devastation. It's a trauma. It's one of the worst things you can ever imagine. That's probably what creates, even things like post-traumatic stress disorder. It's not much about the violence, or probably even the physical strains. It's about the fact that you have seen that you have invested so much of your moral forces in something that you see destroyed in front of your eyes, with no way to make it come back, and all what you have done up to that point to make things work is destroyed forever, and someone is taking over and is going to destroy you in a way. It's something that is devastating, shattering. We don't often talk about these aspects. Think about it. How many times when since school, like someone told you something about history, focused on the aspects of, okay, two countries fought a war, then one lost, and okay, yeah, the other went on and the other took it. But have you ever thought what it means? I know that our culture naturally exalts the winners most of the times, right? It says, okay, well, these are the guys who made it, they're kind of heroes, whoa, yay. And we do it. I'm not talking just about recent times, it's not a political statement. Think about even other realities in millennia ago, right? There is this idea that the guy who was the strongest, who won war, was the coolest. In many ways, we have this instinct. It's probably an instinctive sympathy. We know, anthropologically speaking, this is actually an evolutionary thing. But have you ever rationalized? And for that, in fact, it takes a lot more of sensitivity and understanding and intelligence. What it means to take a defeat, to internalize a defeat, to even make in a way that defeat doesn't bring something worse. Think about the defeat of Germany after World War I, right? We can't say the French had to be lighter on the Germans so that we would have not had Nazism, because also that is like saying, okay, but World War I had been fought for a reason. So you could mishandle certain situations. Surely World War II could be could have been averted in many ways from several years before and even up to fairly recent times, but things went otherwise. But just think about the fact that in a way or another, from that defeat, the seeds of National Socialism were set in a world that brought 20 years afterwards. I mean, and that's mind-blowing, because it makes you realize that defeats are not to be simply, passed as saying everything is fine, or those guys have really learned the lessons. Think about the American Civil War in many ways, in certain attitudes, right? That is not to generalize from any side, but, there are also certain realities that must be acknowledged. The same goes after World War II. Actually, by the 1950s, even in Germany, most people were actually fine still with National Socialism. And these guys had been razed to the ground, literally, during the war. And fortunately, things have somewhat changed. But even in there, don't think that things go past simply, at some point someone is cool again, is new again, is fresh again. These cars have no consequences, because actually they do, and they keep creating big problems, even in today's war, even if politically we don't want to acknowledge that for reasons that in fact largely ignore these realities, right? We want to think everything is fine, right? This is an attitude, it's a relative thing that I think it's particularly proper of the West in after World War II, that we assumed that since that thing is over, then everything was fine afterwards. Actually, it's not been like that, right? There's been a lot of continuity in things that really didn't work at all, to say euphemistically, and that we should be scared of. And are also further problems that arrived afterwards that also we didn't give much of a damn to address, because we said, I don't know, we are now, well, of course, there were other things to think at, like things like the Cold War, but once again, this is the point, that there's not a stopping point in history, right? There is no end of history illusion. Things go on, and you can't simply, it's like, stopping to use the wheel just after you have passed a turn. You can't think the car will go on by itself, right, without being driven. And this is an enormous responsibility for everybody, because our political systems are something enormous at this point. We have an enormous destructive potential in every way. This is not to do with the military and such. It's probably a political, social problem. And we are mishandling that in a way that we will have to fit it, with damages that are accumulating. At some point, these problems will have to be solved. And I can't say it will be too late, because once again, everything can change. But these are also problems that are not going to be solved by themselves. Someone will have especially to pay for them, and this could trigger other problems again and again. So always remember the perspective of who breaks, and for understanding, if anything, better why he had gotten to that place in the first place, right? War is not a football match. Unfortunately, it seems stupid to even point out, but believe me, it's not, because the newer generations have literally no idea of all this. They're being grown with the internet, where everything is truly like a football game. It's all about video games. It's about mixing history with identitarism, with fiction, with competition, with this idea that after all, you can't pick the team that you want as long as you think it's cool, and then not knowing anything about what the actual history that these guys live within also it actually is from a historical point of view. And we have no idea. We're not teaching anyone about this. We're not doing it by the slightest. There is no educational system that even cares by the slightest, right? We are simply continuing to pick teams in a way or another, right? Even if when we want to correct this team picking, we do it by picking another team in opposition. That's the worst thing you can do to solve the problem. And nobody addresses it. Nobody points this out. This is terrifying. We went a bit off track, but I think this is worth pointing out. Because, as we have seen from von Clausewitz, war is combat. So you can't think of wars being fought in the first place from a political point of view if you don't understand how the person is willing to literally die, right, in combat Because that's what it ultimately is, and we all know that. Right? We can't talk about these things over and over again, trying to exercise them, thinking about this kind of exoteric understanding of how complex the thing is. Yeah, but war gets down to fighting, and that's actually much more simple than what all the sophistry around it that our culture has felt that the emotional need to create to I don't know, to cope mainly with the ignorance about it, with the refusal of even facing and understanding even the ugliest sides of it. So it is. So, but anyhow, von Clausewitz comes back on this comparative relation, says, and the comparative relation of the physical losses is difficult to estimate in a battle, but not so the relation of the moral ones. Right? This is also very interesting, and it brings us back to the point that, of course, in war, that war is primarily a clash between moral forces. Right? Our obsession we can't get rid of, is the idea that technology wins wars, that the wars are primarily a matter of quantities, of measurable strength. It's none of that. None of that by the slightest. Wars are primarily a clash between moral forces. All the rest comes second by definition. Right? It's not that there's an exception, like a war that is won by technology. Right? Those are people that get hallucinated by the fact that the technology was the tip of the iceberg and the tip of the balance, and they ignore the iceberg under it. And therefore, they have no idea that the thing flows on the base of whichever even has the reason to invest in a technology for which purpose, whether he can use that or not, whether you have resources for having that technology, and what it takes to get them. That's where the illusion comes from. And that's also an enormous problem, because team picking passes even through this simplistic, ignorant, uninformed, illiterate ideas of reality. And paradoxically, and this is the thing that really makes the Vom Kriege so great, is that actually the moral forces, von Clausewitz says, are even more understandable than the physical ones. So we have talked about this endlessly in the previous books, but the point that we rationalizing everything is not properly the answer, in that actually we should invest enormously on our human intuition. That is probably what makes us pretty clear what even are the emotions of a person without even calculating a single number. That's enormous, right? And the thing von Clausewitz points out here, he says, it's the moral forces in here are much easier to calculate actually than the physical ones in a battle, right? And it gets down essentially to two things. We're talking about combat in general. The one, says, is the loss of ground on which the fight has taken place. The other, the enemies, the superiority of the enemies, right? We'll see how. So it says, the more our reserves have... Okay, so, excuse me, because I don't know if he repeats the thing of the ground afterwards. But anyhow, let's play it now. Basically, the loss of ground means simply, two armies normally are fighting properly on a position that during the battle they rarely abandon. Right? If they do, it's because they are in fact messed up. Things are going downhill and the situation is not bright at all. In other words, as what Clausewitz is putting here, it's when they're losing, tendentially. And this is very important because also we have a flexible idea what a properly battleground is, what a deployment is, what positions are. And the idea is that the more you lose ground, means the more the enemy is winning. And this is important because while the ground is a physical thing, the moral force that is being measured here is not. So that's a very important thing. It's like, I can say when you play Iron Arms and say, someone that is bringing you up to touch the table from the other side, but that's a valid indicator after all of what all the forces involved are. This is not to say that this doesn't involve the physical ones proper, right? But in battle, they're mostly about the enemy's determination and the superiority of the force of the enemy's force on you, because the enemy can be as determined as hell but still not making to breakthrough. right? The air superiority of the enemies that is calculated, according to von Clausewitz, through the employment of reserves. In fact, he writes, the more our reserves have diminished as compared with those of the enemy, the more force we have used to maintain the equilibrium, and this at once an evident proof of the moral superiority of the enemy is given, which seldom fails to stir up in the soul of the commander a certain bitterness of feeling and a sort of contempt for his own troops. Right, there is this situation in which basically at the beginning of the battle you have deployed all the troops, you say, okay, we have this plan, we're going to see how it goes. And you have already prearranged the army in a way that you presumably think that, will compensate for the enemy's strengths, onslaught. And when you start committing all the troops at once, even the ones you have held in reserve, so those the ones that you kind of counted on to say, okay, this is a matter of feelings, it's difficult, even there is a sensitivity that can help to understand it better. Like when you deploy troops on a battle line, you're here it's interesting that von Clausewitz is pointing out the commander's perspective in here. You're reasoning as, I have this pretty bulky force here that is deployed in a way that I expect to contain the enemy force, and then I place reserves in here to be fully certain that if something goes wrong, you will have to employ them. That's exactly the point. If something goes wrong, you have to employ them, and you start basically feeling that your troops are not going to make it. The commander is probably feeling that his troops are in a way disappointing him on the basis of the plan that is being prearranged, right? And a sort of contempt even. This is interesting because it touches to in fact, to the moral side of the story, to the feelings, to what the situation really is really about, because it has to do with what you feel like. Yeah, you feel the pressure of the enemy. The enemy is pushing from the other side. You understand that this thing can't break from a moment to another. If it breaks, it's the onslaught. It's the slaughter, actually, that we've seen before that's going to follow, right? So it's as if all what you believed in, as we were saying before, was wiped out. That's the break of the moral forces that we're talking about before. So it's an enormous deal in the art of warfare to understand at this point, right? And von Clausewitz writes, but the principal thing is that men who have been engaged for a long continuance of time are more or less like burned out cinders. Their ammunition is consumed, they have melted away to a certain extent, physical and moral energies are exhausted, perhaps their courage is broken as well, right? So we're starting from the reserves. As we've seen, we're sent there as spare forces. Like even the feeling that you have when you send a reserve in is like we're saying, oh, this is going to really heal the situation. This is going to really fill the gap. This is going to stem the enemy onslaught. This is going to hold, right? But gradually, these troops in combat are all going to be worn out, right? So they're not going, as we'll see, and this is particularly true in the tactical dimension when we talk about the difference in this regard. With strategy and tactics, we've seen that in strategy there is not such thing that is properly military related. In tactics there is, right? So that reserves, for example, are of dramatic importance, while on the battlefield, while in strategy they're actually not. You should be, filling every gap and keeping all the forces on the spot, because it's much more brutish iron arm than what actually tactics are, which are much more, generally more sophisticated in proportion with strategical plans and actions, naturally. So these troops are like they have an autonomy that after a while was worn out. So you can't even rely properly on them, and they can't even become an hindrance, because a troop that melts away also brings together all the others. Like it's a devastating sight just from a moral point of view to see, point of the line breaking, because that likely the whole situation is going to collapse from there. You see that the general, just even troops fleeing cause disorder among posterior ranks, for example. There is an enormous deal, and don't think in this regard, because usually routes start from the rear, right? But the rear of the units, not necessarily of the various lines, especially if you have reserves, the troops deployed on various lines, right? That is going to mess up. So this all entails an enormous lot of other aspects about how you you deploy an army, how much space you need between the battle lines, between the various units. These are all things we will see. But the idea simply of the break, the idea that certain troops cannot last more than that, is actually a daily bread. It's daily bread for every army. But it's still something you have to take into account in a functional way, right? Because you know that those forces are going to be spent in a way or in another. And von Clausewitz writes, such a force, irrespective of the diminution in its number, if viewed as an organic whole, is very different from what it was before the combat. And thus, it is that the loss of moral force may be measured by the reserves that have been used as if it were on a foot rule. Right? So, it's a very interesting point, because he says, first of all, what we just explained, it is naturally an army, the same army, even assuming that he hadn't suffered any losses. Right, you're just taking the same army, same people, after and before the battle. Ideally, the army after a battle is much less powerful than the army before the battle. It's just a physical axiom. There isn't much to understand about it. And the reserves, in this regard, become, during combat, as long while troops are worn out, basically like a meter, right, of measurement for this, for properly quantifying how much of your forces are left. So von Clausewitz concludes by saying, lost ground and want of fresh reserves are therefore usually the principal causes which determine a retreat. This is very clear. Right, think of every battle, more or less in its evolution. Think about the ground lost and reserves and how the things follows. And this is mainly the logic of every battle. Mainly, right, principally. Right, not 10% of the times. Most of the times, actually, an overwhelming amount of times. Right. Maybe situations in which, like, there are no reserves proper, or at least the situation is more... like usually, if you analyze a Napoleonic battle, maybe that happened. That is crystalline clear. If you analyze maybe an ancient battle, it's not excessively clear most of the times, but that's just an historical problem more than a practical one, because the same thing happens in the same identical way, right? So you measure literally the moral forces as they vanish, and to eventually cause the retreat from lost ground and fresh reserves. Right? Clausewitz says, but at the same time, we by no means excludes to desire to throw in the shade other reasons which may lie in the interdependence of parts in the army, the general plan, etc. So this is obvious, right? It all depends on which troops, where, how they are deployed, on which ground, what's the enemy, and that's why we're saying at the beginning of the video that every combat naturally is completely different from one another. I mean, not completely, but it's substantially different, and always different from one another. And he says, every combat is therefore the bloody and destructive measuring of the strength of forces, physical and moral. Whoever at the close has the greatest amount of both left is the conqueror. Right? The more forces, this is as simple as it gets, the more forces has some one at the end of the combat, the one is the winner. Right? It's that simple. There's nothing properly to understand. Imagine two people that have been beating each other. One of the two has forces to spend, the other has less. Right? And it comes to an end which the person breaks. The guys won. So it's all actually pretty clear. You can't even make an exercise, as stupid as it can get. Look at, people beating each other on YouTube. Right, look at gangs making. You can't actually analyze this, right? If we can't unfortunately study an entire battle, because we can't be everywhere where thousands of soldiers are at the same time. Look at stupid gangs fighting against each other. There is a logic in there that it's exactly the same, and you can measure it properly by observing everyone, even just two people, properly a duel. Right. Alright, so next time we will go on and observe other and read the rest of the chapter, or yeah, it's probably going to be other two videos because it's fairly long. But you understand how the Vom Kriege never bores you. Like, it always comes up with something dramatically crystalline clear, which all in all is always about the same thing, but it makes you understand it in so many levels, in so many dimensions, that you fundamentally start saying, now I get what this whole thing is about. I understand why von Clausewitz was a genius. I understand what is in here that we can't really draw as a practical realization, which is what many people, even intellectuals, actually fail to do, because they don't see the point, because they never studied war. There's an aspect about war, I want to make a video about it, that is about the fact that there is no other way to learn about it but studying combat. Right? This is something that you can't cry out loud everywhere you go. Like, studying combat in a serious way, of course, has nothing to do with, say, I don't know, I watch war and I kind of understand what it is. Even if you are a victim of that war, even if you are, I don't know, a reporter that saw that war in face, right? A person who studied that war on an historical base, with maps and sources, and reconstructing what the whole strategical and tactical thing deal actually was, and what combat followed like, is the one who is going to understand what that is, more at least than any other, in relative terms. And there is no doubt about this at all. And this is something that, for moralistic, emotionalistic, whichever reasons now, it's kind of concealed in our society. Right? I also came fairly late to acknowledge this stuff. It's as if I had always felt that there was something about this that was worth pointing out, and von Clausewitz gave me the delight proper to understand this, to see that clearly, and to put it into an articulate thinking, to explain it to other people. And I hope that you can do the same. There's not just, thinking this is sort of philosophy of sort of an opinion on a thing. That's very common in our world, where everybody thinks he understands everything because has read half of something his cousin told him. He came up with, this genial thinking of his own. You have to study if you want to understand something of this world. There's no other way of doing it. Why are we doing this series for, according to you? But anyhow, enough said. Every time you come up with these digressions, if you want, but I think they're really worth, because, catching the implications of this thinking is, when you study the thing, is kind of elementary, but pointing it out sometimes can really make the difference, and I hope it will, right? Even if this series is not watched by anyone, as far as I understand, or are just a few faithful followers, but now how many videos have we made? I think more than 80. Well, I don't know, about just the Vom Kriege, and that's very different from, I don't know, you can find audiobooks of the Vom Kriege on YouTube, but completely useless. If you don't study that, what do you think you are going to learn about the Vom Kriege with an audiobook? This text is not to be read or listened to, this is to be studied, which makes the difference between someone who makes use of his or own intelligence and someone who simply is losing his or her own time. Alright, for today we stop here. And I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.